In the damp chill of a Genoese prison, far from the sun-drenched canals of his birth, a man sat with a ghost. The ghost was not of a person, but of a world, a vast, shimmering, and utterly unbelievable empire that lived only behind his eyes. His name was Marco Polo, a merchant of Venice, but in this cell he was a prisoner of war, a captive of his city's bitter rival. His fellow inmates saw a man in his mid-40s, weathered by sun and experience, yet it was his words, not his appearance, that held them captive in turn. He spoke of cities with silver walls, of black stones that burned like wood, of money made from the bark of trees, and of an emperor whose palace was so vast that the roof alone could shelter an army. They called him Il Milione, the man of a million lies. But in the corner, another prisoner, a writer of romances named Rustichello da Pisa, listened not with derision, but with a scribe's rapacious hunger. He saw not a liar, but the vessel of the greatest story ever told. And so, with pilfered parchment and a burning lamp, the two men conspired to build a bridge of words, a bridge that would span the chasm between two worlds, a bridge that would begin not in a Genoese jail, but 2 generations earlier, in the heart of the most audacious trading republic the world had ever known. Venice in the mid-13th century was a city built on water and ambition. It was a kaleidoscope of shimmering reflections, of gold-leafed domes and the sharp, salty tang of the Adriatic. Its lifeblood was trade, its arteries the sea lanes, and its heart the relentless drive of its merchant families. Among the most daring of these were the Polos. In 1260, long before Marco was a name known to anyone but his mother, his father, Niccolo, and his uncle, Maffeo, embarked on a speculative trading venture. They were not explorers seeking glory, but businessmen chasing profit. Their journey took them east, far beyond the familiar ports of Constantinople and the Black Sea, into the lands of the Golden Horde, the westernmost branch of a terrifying and transformative new power, the Mongol Empire. A local war trapped them, blocking their return route. Faced with a choice between stagnation and pushing forward, they did what Polos did best. They moved towards the opportunity. They journeyed deeper into the unknown, traveling for years across the vast, unified territory forged by Genghis Khan. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a brutal but effective unification that had stamped down on banditry and made the ancient Silk Road safer than it had been in centuries. Their long and arduous trek eventually brought them to the court of the great Khan himself, Kublai, the grandson of Genghis. Kublai Khan was no mere barbarian chieftain. He was a man of immense curiosity, a sophisticated ruler presiding over a complex and ancient civilization he had conquered, China. He was fascinated by these strange men from the distant West, the first Latins he had ever met. He peppered them with questions about their lands, their kings, their customs, and most of all, their faith. Seeing an opportunity for cultural and political exchange, Kublai entrusted the Polo brothers with a mission of staggering importance. He asked them to return to their homeland as his ambassadors and bring back 100 learned Christian men to debate with his own scholars, and, more personally, to fetch a vial of oil from the lamp that burned eternally over the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. For the Polo brothers, it was an unimagined honor and a command they could not refuse. They journeyed back west, carrying the Khan's Golden Paisa, a tablet of authority that granted them safe passage, lodging, and horses throughout the vast Mongol domains. When they finally saw the familiar waters of the Venetian lagoon in 1269, 9 years after they had left, they were met with shocking news. The Pope to whom they were to deliver their message was dead, and the papal throne sat empty. Worse, for Niccolo, his wife had passed away, leaving behind a son he had never met, a 15-year-old boy named Marco. For 2 long years, the Polo brothers waited in Venice for a new pope to be elected. In that time, Niccolo became acquainted with the son who was a stranger to him. Marco, a boy on the cusp of manhood, grew up not on his father's knee, but on the whispered legends of his father's journey. Venice was a city of stories, but none could compare to the tales of a distant land called Cathay and its mighty ruler. He listened, his mind ignited, as Niccolo and Maffeo spoke of the sheer scale of the Mongol world. a world so far beyond the comprehension of their countrymen that they often fell silent, unable to find the words. When at last a new pope, Gregory X, was chosen, he could provide the Polos with only 2 friars, not the 100 Kublai had requested. The 2 friars, daunted by the prospect of war and the sheer immensity of the journey ahead, turned back, almost immediately. Undeterred, armed with the Pope's letters and the holy oil from Jerusalem, Niccolo and Maffeo set out once more for the east in 1271. But this time, they were not 2. With them was the 17-year-old Marco, his heart a turbulent sea of excitement and trepidation, about to step from the world of stories into the world of seeing. The journey that followed was an epic that would sear itself into the young man's memory. A 4-year odyssey that was a descent into a geography of marvels and terrors. They sailed first to the Levant, then began the great overland trek. They moved through the lands of modern-day Turkey and Armenia, where Marco saw Mount Ararat, the legendary resting place of Noah's Ark. They entered Persia, a land of shimmering tiled mosques and exquisite gardens, but also of searing deserts and the ever-present threat of robber bands. Here, Marco heard the chilling tales of the old man of the mountain and his cult of assassins who used hashish to create a vision of paradise for their young followers, promising them a return to its pleasures in exchange for absolute murderous obedience. The stories, a blend of fact and folklore, painted a picture of a land where faith and fanaticism were potent and deadly forces. From Persia, their caravan pressed eastward, climbing into the desolate, wind-scoured highlands of the Pamir Plateau. A place so high and cold, Marco would later call it the roof of the world. The air was so thin that fires gave off little heat, and it was difficult to cook. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whistling wind. It was here he saw a species of wild sheep with enormous curling horns, a creature so remarkable that it would one day bear his name, Ovis Ammon Poli. They were entering a world of extremes, a continent of superlatives. After descending from the frozen heights, they faced their next great barrier, the Gobi Desert, which they called the Desert of Lop. It was a vast sea of sand and gravel that took a month to cross. Here, the physical hardship was compounded by psychological dread. Marco wrote of the desert's haunting illusions, of mirages that looked like approaching armies, and of spirits that would call out to travelers by name, luring them from the safety of the caravan to a lonely death in the dunes. The journey became a test of will, a slow, plodding pilgrimage through an endless void, with nothing but the sun, the stars, and the bleached bones of those who had failed before them to mark the way. After what must have felt like an eternity of barren wilderness, the landscape began to change. They started to see signs of intensive cultivation, of organized towns, of the infrastructure of a powerful and centrally controlled state. They had reached the domains of the Great Khan. The contrast was breathtaking. After years in the wild, Marco was now plunged into the heart of the most populous, sophisticated, and technologically advanced civilization on Earth. He was no longer just a traveler, he was a witness. When the 3 Polos, ragged and trail-worn, finally arrived at the Khan's magnificent summer palace at Chengdu, the legendary Xanadu, in 1275, Kublai Khan came out to greet them. He recognized the 2 elder Polos immediately and welcomed them warmly. But his gaze soon fell upon the young man at their side. "Who is this?" the emperor asked. "My lord," replied Niccolo, bowing low, "this is my son and your servant." Kublai Khan, a man whose genius lay in his ability to recognize and utilize talent, regardless of its origin, was immediately taken with the young Marco. Here was not just a merchant's son, but a young man with a keen eye, a retentive memory, and an insatiable curiosity. Marco, for his part, rapidly adapted. He threw himself into learning the languages and customs of the court, quickly mastering several of the languages used in the multicultural empire, including the official Mongol script. The Khan, weary of the formulaic and often obsequious reports from his own bureaucrats, saw in Marco a perfect tool, a foreign observer, unburdened by local factionalism, who could travel to the remote corners of his empire and report back exactly what he saw. Thus began the most extraordinary chapter of Marco Polo's life. For the next 17 years, he was not a Venetian merchant. He was an emissary of the Mongol Emperor. His new life was a whirlwind of missions that took him across the length and breadth of Cathay, or China. He traveled south to the old Song dynasty capital of Kinsai, Hangzhou, a city that staggered his European sensibilities. He described it as, without doubt, the finest and noblest city in the world. He marveled at its 12,000 stone bridges, its vast lake dotted with pleasure barges, its bustling marketplaces filled with goods from all over Asia, and its highly organized civil services, including a fire watch and paved roads. It was a vision of urban life on a scale Venice could not even imagine. He traveled southwest into the rugged province of Yunnan, a region of jungles, mountains, and diverse ethnic groups bordering on Burma and Tibet. He observed their customs, from their use of cowrie shells and salt as currency to their unique spiritual beliefs. He saw crocodiles for the first time, describing them as giant serpents with 2 legs, and noted the local production of porcelain. Everywhere he went, Marco absorbed information with the precision of a cartographer and the wonder of a poet. It was the mundane details of Yuan dynasty life that were, to a European, the most fantastical. He described the widespread use of black stones that burn, or coal, a fuel almost unknown in Europe, which allowed for a level of industrial production that was staggering. He detailed the empire's incredible communication network, the YAM system. This was a postal relay of unparalleled efficiency, with stations positioned every 25 miles, housing fresh horses and messengers ready to ride at a moment's notice. This system could carry a message from the capital to the farthest reaches of the empire in a matter of days, a feat of logistics that dwarfed anything in the West. Most astonishing of all was the concept of paper money. In Europe, wealth was tangible: gold, silver, gems, land. But in Cathay, the Khan commanded his subjects to accept pieces of paper, made from the bark of the mulberry tree and stamped with his official seal, as legal tender for all transactions. The penalty for refusing it was death. To Marco, this was a form of economic alchemy, a testament to the absolute and almost divine power of the emperor, who could create wealth seemingly from nothing. He meticulously described the process of its creation, its circulation, and how worn-out notes were traded for new ones, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of a fiat currency system that would not take hold in Europe for centuries. During these years, the 3 Polos prospered immensely. They held a privileged position at the court, amassing a fortune in jewels and precious goods. Yet as the years stretched into a decade and then beyond, a subtle anxiety began to creep in. They were outsiders, their fortunes entirely dependent on the goodwill of one man. Kublai Khan was growing old. His health was failing. What would happen when he died? A new Khan might not look so favorably upon these foreign favorites. The desire to see Venice again, to walk the familiar flagstones of the Piazza San Marco, grew stronger with each passing year. But the Khan had grown fond of them and was reluctant to let them go. Their chance finally came through a matter of diplomacy and marriage. A Mongol princess, the 17-year-old Kukulkan, was to be sent from China to Persia to marry the Ilkhan, a Mongol ruler there. The overland route was deemed too perilous due to turmoil in the intervening Khanates. A sea voyage was the only option. The Persian envoys who had come to fetch her were unnerved by the prospect of such a long and dangerous journey. They needed experienced guides. Who better than the Polos, men who had traversed the world and were familiar with both land and sea? It was the perfect pretext. With great reluctance, Kublai Khan agreed, seeing the wisdom in the plan. He fitted them out with a fleet of 14 massive Chinese junks, each with multiple masts and watertight compartments, a technology far superior to European shipbuilding of the time. He charged them with the safe delivery of the princess and, as a final gesture of his esteem, granted them their freedom to continue home after their mission was complete. In 1292, the great fleet set sail from the southern port of Quanzhou. The 3 Venetians, now seasoned veterans of the Asian world, were once again on the move. this time accompanied by the princess and an entourage of 600 courtiers and sailors. The journey home would prove to be as perilous as the journey out. It was a 2-year voyage through the treacherous waters of the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. They sailed past the coast of Champa, southern Vietnam, and then were forced, by monsoons, to spend 5 months on the island of Sumatra. Here, Marco observed a world starkly different from the refined civilization of Cathay. He wrote of cannibals and headhunters, of exotic spices like nutmeg and cloves growing wild, and of a bestiary of strange animals, including what he called unicorns, in reality, rhinoceroses. From Sumatra, the fleet navigated the treacherous strait and crossed the Bay of Bengal to Ceylon, Sri Lanka, the island of gems, where he marveled at the world's largest ruby belonging to the local king. They then sailed up the coast of India, a land of bewildering diversity. Marco described the pearl divers of the Malabar coast, the austere practices of Hindu yogis who lived on nothing but water and bran, the complex caste system, and the worship of countless gods. He was a meticulous ethnographer, recording customs, without the judgmental lens that characterized many later European accounts. The voyage was brutal. Storms battered the fleet, and disease ran rampant through the ships. Of the 600 people who had left China, only 18, including the 3 polos and the princess herself, survived the journey. When they finally limped into the Persian port of Hormuz, they had fulfilled their duty. They delivered the sad but resilient Princess Kokakin to her intended husband, or, as it turned out, his son, as the Ilkhan had died in the interim. Here, too, they received the news they had long dreaded and expected. The great Kublai Khan was dead. Their protector was gone. Their world had changed forever. Their decision to leave when they did had been the right one. After a brief stay in Persia, they began the final leg of their journey, traveling overland through Tabriz and Trebizond to the port of Constantinople, and from there, by ship, to the one place on earth they now longed for more than any other: Venice. When 3 figures in rough Mongol-style Tartar coats, their faces weathered beyond recognition and their Italian speech thick with foreign accents, appeared at the door of the Polo family home in 1295, they were turned away. No one recognized them. After 24 years, Niccolò Maffeo and Marco Polo were strangers in their own city, ghosts from a forgotten past. The story of what happened next became a Venetian legend. To prove their identities, the 3 travelers hosted a lavish banquet. They appeared first in their coarse traveling clothes, then changed into robes of crimson satin, and finally into robes of crimson damask. At each change, they had the previous set of clothes cut up and distributed to the servants. Then, for the finale, they brought out the ragged Tartar coats they had arrived in. Taking sharp knives, they sliced open the seams and hems. A river of jewels, rubies, sapphires, diamonds, and emeralds, the compressed and portable fortune of a lifetime, in the east, tumbled onto the table, glittering in the candlelight. All of Venice was struck dumb with amazement. The Polos were home. Marco, now a wealthy man in his early 40s, settled into the life of a Venetian merchant. But he was a man apart. He told his stories of Cathay, of the great Khan, of paper money and burning stones, to anyone who would listen. He became a local celebrity, but also an object of ridicule. The scale of his claims was simply too vast for the medieval mind to process. A city with 12,000 bridges, an emperor with a stable of 10,000 white horses, a million lies. He was Marco il Milione. His stories were fantastical entertainment, not geography, not truth. His real legacy might have evaporated into the mists of the lagoon had it not been for the unending rivalry between Venice and Genoa. In 1298, 3 years after his return, a naval battle broke out between the 2 maritime republics. Marco, commanding a Venetian galley, was captured and thrown into the Palazzo di San Giorgio, the Genoese prison. It was here, in this moment of defeat and captivity, that his true life's work would begin. His cellmate was Rustichello da Pisa, a jobbing writer, a composer of Arthurian romances and chivalric tales. Rustichello was captivated by Marco's stories. But unlike the scoffers in Venice, he had the vision to see their monumental importance and the skill to give them form. For months, in the gloom of their shared cell, an extraordinary collaboration took place. Marco dictated, drawing on his prodigious memory, his notes, and perhaps journals he had brought back. He unspooled the entire tapestry of his journey, from the canals of Venice to the court of Kublai Khan and back again. Rustichello wrote, shaping Marco's plain, merchant-like prose into a more literary form, writing not in Italian or Latin, but in Franco-Italian, the linguistic currency of chivalric literature at the time. The book they created was not called The Travels of Marco Polo. Its original title was Il Milione, the Million, which later became Livre des Merveilles du Monde, Book of the Marvels of the World, or simply A Description of the World. Upon his release from prison in 1299, Marco returned to Venice, married, had 3 daughters, and lived out the rest of his days as a respected, if eccentric, citizen. The book, meanwhile, took on a life of its own. Copied by hand, translated and retranslated, edited and embellished by scribes, it spread across Europe like wildfire. It was a medieval bestseller. Yet for generations it was read primarily as a romance, a collection of fabulous tales to be filed alongside the legends of Prester John or the voyages of Sir John Mandeville. The idea that it could be a sober, factual account was, for most, unthinkable. The world it described was just too big, too wealthy, too other. As Marco lay on his deathbed in the winter of 1324, surrounded by family, a priest implored him to save his soul. He urged Marco to recant, to admit that the fantastic stories he had told were mere fictions. It was his last chance to confess his lies before God. Marco's response, whispered from the threshold of death, became his ultimate testament, a defiant defense of a life lived beyond the horizons of belief. "I have not told," he said, "half of what I saw." He was right. For all its marvels, his book was an understatement, a merchant's conservative inventory of a reality that was even grander than his words. But those words, treated as lies for so long, began to take root in the European imagination. They were seeds of possibility. Cartographers began tentatively to redraw their maps, stretching Asia eastward, adding in the names of Cathay and Kinsai. Merchants dreamed of bypassing the middlemen of the Levant and trading directly with the source of the world's spices and silks. And explorers, most notably a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus, pored over their annotated copies of A Description of the World. Columbus was not looking for a new continent. He was looking for Marco Polo's China. He carried the book with him on his voyage, convinced that the islands he encountered were the outlying parts of the Khan's domain. He died believing he had reached the outskirts of the world Marco had described. In the end, the prisoner of Genoa outlived his captors and his mockers. The man of a million lies had, in fact, given Europe a million truths. He had bequeathed to the West not a fantasy, but a roadmap to the future. He replaced myth with knowledge, however incomplete, and fear of the unknown with a burning curiosity. He stretched the boundaries of the possible and, in doing so, created a bridge of words, built in a prison cell, that led Europe out of its medieval confines and toward the dawn of a new age of discovery. The world he revealed was so vast and so wondrous that it had to be disbelieved until, one by one, future generations set out in his wake to see it for themselves.